There is a question that archaeologists have been trying to answer for decades, and that the more they study it, the harder it becomes to answer with certainty. When did human history really begin? The conventional answer for a long time was simple. History began with writing about 5,500 years ago in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Everything before that was prehistory, a time without documents, without proper cities, without civilization in the full sense of the word. Human beings living before writing were, in this view, nomadic hunters and gatherers who wandered the landscape in small groups, without permanent structures, without complex social organization, without projects that extended beyond the next hunting season. That image was comfortable and orderly. It was also profoundly incorrect. In 1994, a Kurdish shepherd walking across an arid hill in southeastern Turkey stumbled on something protruding from the earth, the top of a carved limestone pillar. When archaeologists arrived to investigate the find, what they discovered left them speechless for years. Beneath that hill, deliberately buried about 10,000 years ago, was a complex of circular structures formed by limestone pillars up to 5.5 meters tall and weighing up to 20 tons, decorated with animal reliefs carved with extraordinary precision and artistic skill. The place was called Göbekli Tepe, which in Turkish means belly hill, and it was 12,000 years old. If you have not yet subscribed to the channel, this is a good moment to do so. Every week we explore a different world with a calm narration designed to accompany your rest. 12,000 years. That means Göbekli Tepe was built 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the pyramids of Giza, and more than 6,000 years before the first Mesopotamian cities with cuneiform writing appeared. It was built by people who, according to all previous models of human prehistory, should not have been capable of building it. They had no established agriculture. They had no domestic animals. They had, apparently, none of the preconditions that archaeologists believed necessary for organizing the large-scale collective labor that a structure like that required. The Neolithic transition in the Fertile Crescent was not a single event but a mosaic of regional trajectories, each shaped by local ecology, local culture, and local contingency. In some areas, the shift toward agriculture was rapid and decisive. In others, communities maintained mixed economies for centuries or millennia, combining cultivated plants and domestic animals with continued hunting and gathering. That regional diversity is important because it means there was no single model of how the Neolithic Revolution unfolded. It was a set of parallel experiments in new ways of living, some of which succeeded, some of which failed, and many of which left traces in the archaeological record that only recent research has begun to properly interpret. Göbekli Tepe sits at the very beginning of this period of experimentation, when the outcome was still entirely open. And yet they built it. Göbekli Tepe is not an isolated anomaly. It is the oldest and most spectacular of a series of sites that in recent decades have been rewriting the history of the first sedentary or proto-sedentary human beings. In Turkey, in Israel, in Jordan, in Syria, in the Eastern Mediterranean, archaeologists have found structures, settlements, and monuments that demonstrate that social complexity, collective organization, and the capacity for monumental construction appeared in human history much earlier than any previous model had predicted. The comparison between the oldest and most recent columns of Göbekli Tepe reveals a trend that archaeologists have called the paradox of simplification. The oldest structures, which are also the deepest and which required the greatest constructive effort, are the most elaborate in their design and the richest in decoration. The more recent structures are smaller, less elaborate, and with sparser decoration. That tendency toward simplification could reflect a change in the circumstances of the communities that maintain the site, perhaps a reduction in the population available to participate in construction work, or perhaps a change in beliefs that made monumental scale less important. The dating of Göbekli Tepe's columns using carbon-14 and optically stimulated luminescence techniques produced dates that the archaeologists working on the site took time to fully accept, so contrary were they to everything that had been expected. The oldest layers of the site, containing the largest and best carved columns, date from between 9,600 and 8,800 BCE. The more recent layers, with smaller and less elaborate structures, date from approximately 8,000 to 7,500 BCE. That temporal sequence, showing a site that was built and used for at least 2,000 years and that was progressively simplifying its architecture before being abandoned and buried, raises fascinating questions about the trajectory of the tradition that created it. The transition from the pre-agricultural world of Göbekli Tepe to the fully agricultural world of later Neolithic settlements was not experienced as a sudden break, but as a gradual shift in emphasis across many generations. The communities of the early Neolithic continued to hunt and gather even as they began to rely more heavily on cultivated plants and domestic animals, and the boundary between the two economic strategies was permeable and variable for centuries. What changed most dramatically was not the food supply immediately, but the social organization. The permanence of agricultural settlements allowed the accumulation of property and the development of more formal hierarchies. The storage of surpluses created new opportunities for some individuals to control resources that others depended on. And the concentration of population in villages created new social tensions and new mechanisms for managing them. Those social changes, which are as fundamental as the economic ones, are part of what makes the Neolithic Revolution one of the most consequential transitions in the history of our species. The quarries from which the limestone used in Göbekli Tepe came have been identified in the vicinity of the site, at distances ranging from a few hundred meters to several kilometers. In those quarries, archaeologists have found unfinished columns that were abandoned at different stages of their manufacture, probably because they fractured during the carving process or because something interrupted the work before they could be completed. Those unfinished columns are extraordinary documents of the manufacturing process. They show how the craftspeople began by carving the outline of the column directly into the bedrock, gradually separating it from the substrate on its sides and base until it was free and could be transported to the construction site. One of those unfinished columns has estimated dimensions of more than 7 meters in length and a weight of more than 50 tons. The landscape that surrounded Göbekli Tepe 12,000 years ago was very different from the arid and rocky terrain that characterizes the region today. Pollen analyses of the site's sediments show a much wetter and more wooded landscape than the present one, with oaks, pistachios, and other tree species that today only grow in areas with much more rainfall. That more humid landscape would have supported much denser populations of wild animals, especially gazelles and other ungulates, which explains why the communities that built Göbekli Tepe could afford to dedicate so much time and energy to monumental construction without needing agriculture. The environment provided sufficient resources to feed large groups of people during periods of collective work. The tools used to carve the reliefs of Göbekli Tepe have been analyzed in detail, and the analysis reveals a sophisticated toolkit of stone implements that were carefully chosen and shaped for different stages of the work. Rough flint picks were used for the initial removal of large quantities of stone, shaping the basic form of the column and the rough outline of the relief figures. Finer flint burins and scrapers were then used to develop the detail of the carvings, working at smaller scales and with more control. The final surface finish, which in some reliefs has a smoothness that suggests polishing, was probably achieved with ground stone or with organic abrasives like sand and water. Each stage of that process required specific tools that had to be manufactured and maintained by skilled workers, adding a further dimension to the logistical complexity of operating the site. The astronomical relationship of Göbekli Tepe is a topic that generates both popular enthusiasm and scientific caution. Several researchers have proposed that some of the site structures were deliberately oriented toward specific points on the horizon where the sun rose or set at astronomically significant moments, such as solstices or equinoxes. Those proposals, if confirmed, would add a cosmological dimension to the ritual function of the site. However, rigorous verification of astronomical orientation hypotheses requires measurements and analyses still in progress, and the archaeologists responsible for the site remain prudent about the more enthusiastic claims regarding its astronomical significance. The technical skill needed to carve those reliefs in hard limestone, with tools of stone and bone, was considerable. The craftspeople who created them were not improvising beginners. They were experts who had developed their skill over years of practice, who knew the properties of the rock they were working and who applied refined techniques to obtain the effects they sought. That implies the existence of an established craft tradition, transmitted from masters to apprentices, much earlier than previous models would have predicted. The iconography of Göbekli Tepe's reliefs has been studied in detail by researchers, who have identified an apparent hierarchy in the representation of different animals. Vultures, foxes, and snakes are the most frequently represented animals, and archaeologists have proposed various interpretations of their symbolic significance. Vultures, which in many cultures are associated with death and transformation, could be related to practices of excarnation, the process of removing flesh from corpses before final burial, which is documented in the Near Eastern Neolithic. Snakes, with their capacity to shed their skin, have been associated in many cultural traditions with regeneration and the cycle of life. But any specific interpretation of Göbekli Tepe's iconography is necessarily provisional, because we do not have access to the system of meanings in which those images were read by their creators. The question of who organized the construction of Göbekli Tepe is deceptively simple. Moving 20-ton columns from the quarries where they were carved to the construction site, raising them to vertical position, and organizing the labor of hundreds or perhaps thousands of workers during construction periods required a level of social coordination that, according to previous models of prehistory, should have been impossible without the authority structures associated with complex agrarian societies. The answer emerging from the most recent research is that previous models were wrong in their fundamental assumptions about the social organization of hunter-gatherers. The Epi-Paleolithic and early Neolithic communities were not disorganized bands of individuals following animals from place to place without any complex social structure. They were communities with elaborate kinship systems, intertribal alliances, ritual calendars, and collective decision-making mechanisms that could coordinate large-scale efforts when the motivation was strong enough. That motivation, in the case of Göbekli Tepe, appears to have been ritual and symbolic in nature. The site has no evidence of permanent habitation. There are no domestic hearths, no everyday refuse deposits, no storage structures that would characterize a permanent settlement. What there is are the monumental structures, the remains of large-scale feasts, and the evidence that the site was visited repeatedly by large groups of people over a period of at least 1,000 years. The recovery of Göbekli Tepe from millennia of burial is also a story about the development of archaeological methods. When excavations began in the 1990s, the techniques available for documenting and analyzing the site were already far more powerful than those available to earlier generations of archaeologists. Digital photography, three-dimensional scanning, GIS mapping, and a growing suite of scientific dating and geochemical analysis methods all contributed to the quality and completeness of the documentation that was produced from the beginning of serious excavation. That high-quality documentation means that even the portions of the site that have been excavated and exposed to the elements since the 1990s are preserved in a digital form that will be available to researchers indefinitely, even if the physical structures eventually deteriorate. In this sense, Göbekli Tepe inverts the causal sequence that archaeologists had taken for granted for decades. The conventional idea was that agriculture created the surpluses that allowed specialists to be maintained, including religious specialists, who in turn built the temples. Göbekli Tepe suggests that the temples came first, that the need to gather at a sacred place for collective rituals was the motivation that drove communities to organize themselves in more complex ways, and that this more complex social organization was one of the factors that contributed to the subsequent development of agriculture. Religion, or at least collective ritual, might have been the cause of civilization, not its consequence. The micro-wear analysis of flint tools from Göbekli Tepe, The study under microscope of the patterns of wear on cutting edges that reveal what those edges were used for has produced results that help flesh out the daily activities carried out at the site. The wear patterns on most of the flint tools suggest use for plant processing, woodworking and hideworking rather than for hunting, which is consistent with the interpretation of the site as a gathering place where food preparation and construction activities were the dominant forms of work. The relative scarcity of hunting-related tool wear in the site assemblage, compared with its abundance in the campsites documented in the surrounding landscape, suggests that Göbekli Tepe was a specialized place where particular activities were carried out, not a general-purpose camp where the full range of hunter-gatherer subsistence activities took place. Göbekli Tepe is not the only site of that period that is rewriting prehistory. About 30 kilometers to the north, at the site of Karahan Tepe, archaeologists have found in recent years another concentration of monumental stone structures of similar antiquity. The excavations at Karahan Tepe, which began seriously after 2019, have revealed columns similar to those of Göbekli Tepe but with distinctive features of their own, including life-size human figures carved directly into the bedrock and an underground chamber with columns representing schematic human figures of disturbing realism. In the same region, archaeologists have identified several other sites of similar characteristics. Taz Tepeler, which means stone hills in Turkish, is the name given to a set of at least a dozen monumental sites from the same period in southeastern Turkey. Together, those sites suggest that the region was a center of ritual and monumental activity of a scale and density that has no parallel anywhere else in the world during that period. For at least 2,000 years, between approximately 10,000–8,000 BCE, southeastern Turkey was the heart of a tradition of monumental construction that involved communities from a wide geographic area in a shared project of creating and maintaining sacred places. In Jericho, the city most often mentioned as the oldest in the world, excavations have revealed a sequence of occupation beginning around 10,000 BCE, with the first permanent structures, and including around 8,000 BCE the construction of a circular stone tower more than 8 meters tall, associated with a wall, which is the oldest known defensive structure. That Tower of Jericho, built by people who still depended partly on hunting and gathering for their subsistence, is another example of the capacity of early Neolithic communities to organize building projects on a scale that previous models did not anticipate. At Çatalhöyük, in central Anatolia, archaeologists have excavated a settlement of the 7th and 6th millennia BCE that at its peak housed between 5,000 and 10,000 people, making it one of the first true cities in the world. Çatalhöyük has features that run completely counter to intuitions about how cities should be. The houses have no doors at ground level and are only accessed from the roof, which turns the rooftops into the main circulation routes of the settlement. The interior of the houses was decorated with wall paintings and reliefs depicting animals and hunting scenes with extraordinary vitality and artistic skill. And the dead were buried beneath the floors of the very dwellings, maintaining a physical proximity between the living and their ancestors that says much about that community's beliefs about the relationship between life and death. The period archaeologists call the Neolithic, covering approximately 10,000 to 4,000 BCE depending on the region, was one of the most transformative in human history. The social memory of Göbekli Tepe in the communities that maintained it across 2,000 years of use is an aspect of the site's history that is impossible to access directly but important to try to imagine. How did the communities that visited the site in its later phases understand the relationship between themselves and the builders of its earliest and most elaborate structures? Did they see themselves as continuing a tradition established by their ancestors, maintaining a sacred space that had been used by their grandparents and great-grandparents back through time beyond living memory? Or did they see the older structures as the work of a different people, inherited rather than created, a legacy they were obligated to honor even if the specific meanings of the carvings had already been partially lost? Those questions are unanswerable with current evidence, but they are worth asking because they illuminate the general problem of how communities relate to a past that is within their tradition but beyond their direct experience. During that period, the communities of the Fertile Crescent and adjacent regions made the transition from an economy based on hunting and gathering to one based on agriculture and animal husbandry. That process, which archaeologists call the Neolithic Revolution, was neither rapid nor simple. It unfolded over thousands of years, with advances and setbacks, with regions that adopted agriculture while neighboring ones maintained more traditional lifestyles, with communities that practiced incipient agriculture and hunting and gathering simultaneously for extended periods before making a complete transition. The domestication of plants and animals was itself a gradual and in many respects accidental process. The wild cereals, such as einkorn wheat and wild barley, grew naturally on the hillsides of the Fertile Crescent, and hunter-gatherer communities had been collecting them since time immemorial. But when those communities began to remain longer in the same places, to eliminate the weeds competing with the cereals, to scatter their seeds in areas where they did not grow naturally, they were involuntarily beginning the domestication process. The plants that grew best near human settlements, those that produced larger or easier to harvest seeds, those that ripened more synchronously, were the ones most likely to be harvested and to have their seeds dispersed by humans. Without any deliberate intention of modifying the plants, the early Neolithic hunter-gatherer communities were exerting selection pressure that, over hundreds of generations, transformed wild cereals into the domesticated crops their descendants would come to depend on completely. The Younger Dryas was an abrupt cooling period that occurred approximately between 12,900 and 11,700 years ago, interrupting the gradual warming that had followed the end of the last glaciation. During that period, temperatures in the northern hemisphere fell several degrees within decades, glaciers advanced again, and the climate of many regions became colder, drier, and more variable. For the human communities of the Fertile Crescent, which at that time were in the process of developing the proto-cities and ritual centers like Göbekli Tepe, the Younger Dryas represented a first-order ecological challenge. What is fascinating from the perspective of the history of civilizations is the response that the Fertile Crescent communities gave to the Younger Dryas challenge. Instead of simply retreating to more nomadic and dispersed lifestyles, as might have been expected given a reduction in available resources, some communities responded by intensifying their exploitation of local resources, including the intensification of wild cereal collection that could have been one of the initial steps toward deliberate agriculture. That intensifying rather than dispersing response to environmental stress is one of the defining characteristics of the proto-sedentary communities of the early Neolithic. The management of water resources at Göbekli Tepe and related early Neolithic sites is another aspect that archaeologists are beginning to understand better. Geomorphological analyses of the environment around Göbekli Tepe show that the site was built in a position that maximized the collection of rainwater, with the hill acting as a natural collection point that directed water toward the inhabited areas at its base. That attention to water management, which is fundamental for any settlement or gathering place where large groups of people need to remain hydrated over extended periods, suggests that the site's builders had a sophisticated understanding of local hydrology and incorporated that knowledge into their design and placement decisions. The global significance of the Fertile Crescent as the origin point of the agricultural revolution that would eventually reshape the entire planet cannot be overstated. The wild progenitors of the 8 founder crops of Western agriculture, einkorn wheat, emmer wheat, barley, pea, lentil, bitter vetch, chickpea, and flax, all grew naturally in or near the Fertile Crescent. The wild ancestors of the 4 main domestic animals of Western agriculture, sheep, goat, pig, and cattle, all had their natural ranges in or adjacent to the Fertile Crescent. That concentration of domesticable species in a single region is not a coincidence but a reflection of the particular ecological history of the region, which was shaped by the same geological and climatic processes that created the conditions for the evolution of those species in the first place. Göbekli Tepe sits within this extraordinarily productive ecological zone, and its construction by communities who were on the cusp of learning to exploit that productivity in entirely new ways gives it a pivotal position in the story of how the modern world came to be. The waste management at Göbekli Tepe provides unexpectedly rich information about the scale and nature of the gatherings held there. The fill deposits covering the oldest structures contain, along with soil and flint fragments, enormous quantities of animal bones, mostly gazelles and other wild species. Zooarchaeological analysis of those bones shows that most of the animals were slaughtered and consumed at the site, and that the total number of animals represented by those remains is large enough to suggest repeated feasts of hundreds or even thousands of participants. That scale of meat consumption would have required not only the ability to hunt large numbers of animals, but also the logistical organization to transport them to the site, process them and distribute them among participants in an orderly manner. The relationship between Göbekli Tepe and the agricultural settlements of the Neolithic that developed in the same region over the subsequent millennia is one of the most actively researched questions in the archaeology of the Fertile Crescent. Some of those settlements show continuities with the ritual traditions of Göbekli Tepe, including the use of similar symbolic motifs and the continued importance of feasting as a social institution. Others show discontinuities, with new architectural forms, new animal symbolism and new burial practices that suggest significant cultural change between the Epi-Paleolithic hunter-gatherer builders of Göbekli Tepe and the Neolithic farmers who eventually settled the same landscape. Understanding those continuities and discontinuities is central to understanding the cultural dynamics of the Neolithic transition in the region. The role of feasts in building the social cohesion of early Neolithic communities is a topic that archaeology has explored with growing sophistication in recent years. Feasts, in hunter-gatherer societies around the world, are not simply occasions for eating together. They are events that establish and reaffirm hierarchies, create obligations of reciprocity, celebrate alliances, and resolve disputes. The host of a feast acquires prestige and social credit by distributing food among guests, and guests acquire reciprocal obligations that create networks of social interdependence. In the context of Göbekli Tepe, the feasts held at the site during periods of collective work would have been a crucial tool for maintaining the motivation of workers and strengthening the bonds between the communities contributing to the project. The presence of figurative carvings at Göbekli Tepe raises profound questions about the origin and nature of rock art and monumental art in human history. The paintings of the Paleolithic caves of Lascaux, Altamira, and Chauvet, dating from between 17,000 and 36,000 years ago, demonstrate that the capacity for sophisticated artistic representation existed in modern humans long before Göbekli Tepe. But Paleolithic cave art is fundamentally different from the monumental art of Göbekli Tepe in one crucial respect. It was created in closed, dark spaces accessible only to small groups of people, while the art of Göbekli Tepe was created in the open space of a collective gathering place, designed to be seen by all who participated in the site's rituals. That difference between restricted access art and public access art is one of the most significant transitions in human cultural history. The strontium isotope studies on human and animal remains from Göbekli Tepe and contemporary sites are providing valuable information about the catchment radius of people and resources that the site attracted during its periods of activity. Strontium is an element that is incorporated into bones and teeth in proportions reflecting the local geochemistry of the soil and water where the person or animal grew up. Preliminary results suggest that some people and animals came from distances of up to 100 kilometers, confirming that Göbekli Tepe was a convergence center for a wide geographic area. The question of why Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried remains one of the most fascinating mysteries of prehistoric archaeology. Around 8000 BCE, after at least 2,000 years of active use, the communities that maintained the site began deliberately filling the structures with earth and rubble, covering the carved columns and the walls of the circular enclosures under meters of fill. That deliberate burial was not a quick or careless process. The fill is composed partly of earth mixed with remains of animals consumed in feasts, flint fragments, and other objects, suggesting that the process was ritualized, that the communities that buried the site were doing so according to some type of protocol that gave meaning to the act of covering what their ancestors had built. Why they did it is a question that archaeologists still cannot answer with certainty. Some hypotheses point to a change in the religious beliefs or meaning systems of the responsible communities, who might have decided to ritually deactivate a sacred place that no longer corresponded to their worldview. Others suggest that the burial was a form of deliberate preservation, to protect the structures from erosion and deterioration so that they could be rediscovered and reused in the future. What is clear is that the burial of Göbekli Tepe was an act of deliberate memory, not of abandonment. The physical experience of standing inside one of Göbekli Tepe's enclosures, surrounded by the massive carved pillars on all sides, has been described by many of the archaeologists who have worked there as uniquely powerful. The scale of the pillars, their weight and permanence, the quality of the carvings visible at close range, and the knowledge of their age combine to create an experience that is difficult to describe but easy to understand. The experience of direct physical contact with human intentionality from the deepest accessible past. Whatever the original ritual function of those spaces, and whatever the specific meanings of the carvings, the buildings communicate something about the humans who made them simply through their physical presence, their weight, their care, their scale. They are messages from the distant past that arrive not through language but through stone. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe has also transformed our understanding of human cognition in the Upper Paleolithic and Epipaleolithic. The carved columns of the site are not simply functional objects or decorative ornaments. They are complex symbolic representations that require for their creation the capacity to hold abstract images in mind, to translate those images into physical actions on resistant material, and to communicate the design intentions to other workers collaborating in the execution. That complex symbolic capacity, which today we take for granted as a defining characteristic of humanity, was fully developed in the communities that built Göbekli Tepe, long before cities, writing, or any other conventional marker of civilization appeared. The Nomadic quarry site, excavated in the 1980s before being flooded by the Ataturk Reservoir on the Euphrates River, provided the first evidence of structures with T-shaped columns similar to those of Göbekli Tepe, though on a smaller scale. That discovery, which preceded Göbekli Tepe by a few years, should have prepared archaeologists for the surprise to come, but the scale and antiquity of Göbekli Tepe exceeded anything that could have been anticipated from Nomadic quarry. The loss of that site beneath the reservoir waters, before it could be completely excavated with techniques available today, is one of the most lamented tragedies in the archaeology of the Near Eastern Neolithic. The interpretation of the anthropomorphic elements in Göbekli Tepe's carvings, the arm-like projections and finger-like details that appear on some of the central pillars, has been the subject of sustained scholarly debate. If those features represent human or human-like beings, then the pillars may function as ancestral figures, representations of powerful forebears or supernatural beings whose presence sanctified the enclosures and the activities carried out within them. That interpretation would make Göbekli Tepe a place of ancestor veneration, a function that sacred sites have served in cultures around the world from the Paleolithic to the present. But the interpretation remains disputed, partly because the evidence is ambiguous and partly because projecting familiar categories onto unfamiliar cultural contexts carries the risk of seeing what we expect to see rather than what is actually there. The transmission of the technical knowledge necessary to build Göbekli Tepe, from stone carving methods to column transport and erection techniques, implies the existence of a learning and skill transmission system that transcends the scale of any family group. That learning system, which had to function across the boundaries between the different groups contributing to the site's construction, is itself evidence of the social complexity of the late Epipaleolithic communities. The implications of Göbekli Tepe and other early Neolithic sites extend far beyond archaeology. If the hunter-gatherer communities of the 10th millennium BCE were capable of building monuments of the complexity and scale of Göbekli Tepe, then our image of what human beings were in that period needs a fundamental revision. The cognitive capacity, social organization, motivation to invest resources in long-term projects, and technical skill needed to build Göbekli Tepe are essentially the same as those required to build a medieval cathedral or a modern skyscraper, with the obvious exception that the available materials and tools were very different. What differentiated the builders of Göbekli Tepe from the builders of the pyramids of Giza was not intelligence or organizational capacity, but the historical, economic, and technological context in which they operated. That conclusion has implications for the way we think about human progress. The conventional narrative of progress presents history as an ascending line from primitive barbarism to sophisticated civilization, with writing, agriculture, and cities as the milestones that mark the passage from a lower level to a higher one. Göbekli Tepe shows that this narrative is too simple. The human beings who lived 12,000 years ago were not more primitive in any fundamental cognitive or social sense than those who live today. They had different capabilities, adapted to different contexts, and built worlds of meaning and social organization that were appropriate for their time and place. The international collaborations that have characterized the research at Göbekli Tepe and related sites since the 1990s reflect a broader transformation in how archaeological fieldwork is conducted in the modern era. The site is Turkish national heritage, excavated under Turkish government authorization, but the research teams have included scholars from Germany, the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and many other countries, each bringing specialized expertise that no single national tradition could have provided alone. The zooarchaeologists, the paleobotanists, the geoarchaeologists, the isotope geochemists, the DNA analysts, all of those specialists have contributed essential pieces to the picture of Göbekli Tepe that has emerged over the past 3 decades. That international collaborative model, which is now standard in major archaeological projects worldwide, produces a richness of interpretation that would be impossible for any single research tradition. The relationship between Göbekli Tepe and the subsequent emergence of the first cities in the same geographic region is not simply a temporal coincidence. There are researchers who argue that there is a direct causal continuity, that the ritual centers created the social networks, coordination institutions, and shared meaning systems that later allowed the emergence of cities. In this interpretation, the Mesopotamian cities of Ur, Uruk, and Eridu did not arise from nowhere 6,000 years ago, but were the final result of a process of social complexification that had begun at least 4,000 years earlier, in the hills of southeastern Turkey, where epi-Paleolithic communities were building their first collective monuments. The image of the epi-Paleolithic hunter-gatherer as a fundamentally different human being from us, more primitive, more limited in capabilities and cultural horizons, is an image that the discoveries of recent decades have demolished fairly systematically. Ethnographic studies of hunter-gatherer communities that survived into the 20th century in different parts of the world show that those communities had systems of ecological knowledge, practical astronomy, plant medicine, and social organization of a sophistication that has nothing to envy the equivalent systems of agrarian societies. What they lacked was not intelligence or cultural capacity, but access to the specific technologies that the agrarian revolution and its consequences made available to subsequent generations. The archaeology of the Neolithic is also changing our understanding of the relationship between human beings and their landscapes. The builders of Göbekli Tepe did not simply live in the landscape, exploiting its resources and moving on when they were exhausted. They transformed the landscape in deliberate and planned ways, creating places that lasted longer than any individual and that accumulated meaning across generations. That capacity to transform the landscape into a symbolic text, to inscribe in geography the values, beliefs, and history of a community, is one of the most profoundly human characteristics that exists. And Göbekli Tepe shows that this capacity existed 12,000 years before the first cities. The genetic record of current populations is providing a complementary and revolutionary perspective on the history of the first civilizations. The analysis of ancient DNA extracted from human remains at Göbekli Tepe, Çatalhöyük, Ain Ghazal, and other early Neolithic sites is allowing researchers to reconstruct the patterns of movement, mixing, and diversification of human populations during the period when the first complex structures emerged. Those genetic data confirm that the Fertile Crescent was a center of population irradiation toward Europe, Central Asia, and North Africa during the Neolithic, and that the descendants of those Neolithic populations constitute a significant proportion of the genetic ancestry of many current populations. In a certain sense, all current human beings who have ancestry in the regions surrounding the Mediterranean, in Europe, or in Western Asia are descendants of the communities that built Göbekli Tepe and the other structures of the early Neolithic Fertile Crescent. The builders of Göbekli Tepe are not simply our predecessors in an abstract and cultural sense. In many cases, they are also our direct biological ancestors. That genetic connection adds a personal dimension to the contemplation of Göbekli Tepe's reliefs that goes beyond intellectual curiosity. When we look at those carved columns, decorated with animals and figures that carried meanings we can no longer fully recover, we are not only looking at the creations of distant and alien people. We are looking, to some degree, at the first steps of a path that would lead to us through 12,000 years of continuous generations. The role of specialist craftspeople in the construction and maintenance of Göbekli Tepe raises interesting questions about economic organization in pre-agricultural societies. The production of the stone tools used for carving, the selection and quarrying of the limestone columns, the planning and execution of the relief designs, and the structural work of erecting and aligning the pillars all required skills that most members of a hunter-gatherer community would not have possessed. Those specialists must have been supported by the broader community during the periods when they were working at the site, receiving food and other necessities in exchange for their specialized labor. That exchange relationship between specialists and their supporting community is one of the precursors of the more formal economic specialization that would characterize the later Neolithic and the first cities, and Göbekli Tepe offers a window into an early stage of that development. The experience of approaching Göbekli Tepe from the surrounding landscape, following the ancient paths that led to it across the rolling hills, has been recreated hypothetically by researchers trying to understand how the site would have been perceived by the people who visited it. From a distance, the hilltop would have appeared as a distinctive silhouette against the sky, recognizable from kilometers away as a place that was different from the natural landscape around it. As one approached, the scale of the stone structures would have become progressively clearer, building a sense of anticipation and significance that the architects of the site may have deliberately cultivated. The approach experience, the journey toward the sacred place, is often as important as the experience of being there, and the builders of Göbekli Tepe may have designed the approach as carefully as they designed the enclosures themselves. There is an irony in the fact that the places that have taught us most about humanity's first builders are places that their own creators tried to conceal or that chance concealed for them. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried by its builders. Çatalhöyük was abandoned and covered by centuries of sedimentation. The Tower of Jericho was buried beneath the ruins of later cities. The statues of Ain Ghazal were carefully deposited in pits and covered with earth. In all those cases, preservation was the result of concealment, whether deliberate or accidental. And in all those cases, what was preserved allows us to see with extraordinary clarity the world of the communities that created them. That paradox of preservation through concealment has implications for how we think about what we do not know. If what we have found represents a small fraction of what was built, then the worlds we do not yet know must be equally rich and complex. What the archaeological record shows us is inevitably a sample bias toward what was preserved, not toward what was representative. And what was preserved is, by definition, the exceptional, the atypical, what had the luck to be protected from the forces that destroyed everything else. The diffusion of the ideas and techniques associated with Göbekli Tepe toward other regions of the Fertile Crescent and beyond is a topic that geneticists and archaeologists are studying jointly with increasingly interesting results. Ancient DNA analysis of individuals from different early Neolithic sites shows that the first Anatolian farmers, who are most directly related to the communities that built Göbekli Tepe, dispersed toward Europe from approximately 7000 BCE onward, bringing with them not only the seeds and domestic animals of the agrarian revolution, but also the symbolic systems, ritual practices, and craft traditions they had developed in the Fertile Crescent. The debate about whether Göbekli Tepe was built by a single community or by the collaboration of multiple communities is more than a question of technical detail. If it was the project of a single community large and organized enough, that implies a level of sedentarization and social complexity in that single community that is in itself extraordinary. If it was the collaborative project of multiple communities that gathered periodically to work on it, then it implies the existence of intertribal cooperation networks of a scale and stability that previous models would not have predicted. The botanical remains of Göbekli Tepe, the phytoliths, starch grains, and carbonized plant remains recovered from the site sediments, provide a picture of the diet of the people who visited it and the types of plants they processed there. Those remains include wild cereals such as einkorn wheat and wild barley, along with legumes and wild fruits. The presence of large quantities of processed wild cereals at the site suggests that the preparation of large quantities of cereal-based food was an important activity during gathering periods. Some researchers have proposed that this demand for cereals processed in large quantities for the feasts of Göbekli Tepe could have been one of the factors that drove the intensification of collection and incipient cultivation of wild cereals in the region. The relationship between the construction of Göbekli Tepe and the emergence of social inequality is a topic that generates passionate debate among researchers. Some argue that a project of that scale can only have been organized under some form of centralized authority, implying that social inequality was already a feature of the late Epi-Paleolithic communities of the Fertile Crescent. Others argue that the absence of evidence of formal hierarchy in the archaeological record of the site suggests that the project was organized in an egalitarian manner through mechanisms of voluntary cooperation. That second interpretation, if correct, has important implications for the history of social inequality. It suggests that human beings were capable of organizing large-scale collective projects for millennia before the formal hierarchies we associate with the first civilizations emerged. The preservation of Göbekli Tepe under the dry conditions of southeastern Turkey is fortunate but not guaranteed into the future. Climate projections for the region suggest increasing aridity and higher temperatures over the coming decades, which could accelerate the biological and chemical weathering of the exposed stone surfaces. The solution of calcium carbonate that slowly dissolves limestone in contact with acidic water accelerates with higher temperatures, and the biological crusts of lichens and cyanobacteria that colonize the stone surfaces and produce organic acids that accelerate dissolution will likely become more active as the climate warms. The conservation challenge for Göbekli Tepe in the coming century is therefore not just about managing the impact of millions of tourists, but also about managing the impact of a changing climate on one of the world's most important and most irreplaceable archaeological sites. The history of how Göbekli Tepe came to be known to science is itself fascinating. The site had been visited by a University of Chicago team in the 1960s, who had noted it as a possible site of interest but had not excavated it, classifying the stone fragments showing above the surface as medieval or Byzantine remains. It was not until 1994, when German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt visited the site and recognized the true significance of what he was seeing, that systematic excavation began. Schmidt recognized Göbekli Tepe because he had been thinking for years about the conditions that would have preceded the Neolithic Revolution, and had arrived at the conviction that there must exist monumental sites predating agriculture that had not yet been discovered. The archaeological research in southeastern Turkey has experienced a genuine explosion in recent years, partly stimulated by Göbekli Tepe's international success as a tourist destination and as a subject of scientific outreach. New survey and excavation projects have been initiated at dozens of sites in the region, and each field season produces discoveries that expand and complicate the picture being drawn. The sites of Karahan Tepe, Taz Tepeler, Seeberg and others recently identified are revealing a density of monumental activity in the region during the late Epipaleolithic and early Neolithic that exceeds anything previously imagined. The comparison between Göbekli Tepe and the great megalithic monuments of Western Europe, such as Stonehenge in England, Karnak in France, or the dolmens of Ireland, is inevitable though potentially misleading. All those monuments share the characteristic of having been built with large stone blocks by communities that had no access to writing or metallurgy, and all appear to have had ritual or astronomical functions. But the superficial similarities conceal deep differences. The European megalithic monuments are between 2,000 and 5,000 years more recent than Göbekli Tepe, were built by communities that already practiced established agriculture and animal husbandry, and belonged to cultural traditions completely independent of the Fertile Crescent tradition. Megalithism in Europe and monumentalism in the Near Eastern Neolithic are parallel phenomena, not related by direct cultural continuity, which makes their superficial similarity all the more fascinating. It suggests that the tendency to build large ritual stone monuments is a convergent response to similar social needs that can emerge independently in different cultural contexts. The Younger Dryas event, the sudden cooling that interrupted the post-glacial warming between approximately 12,900 and 11,700 years ago, affected not only the ecology of the Fertile Crescent but also the human communities living there in ways that the archaeological record is only beginning to reveal. Population movements, abandonment of some sites and intensification of use at others, shifts in the mix of plant and animal species exploited, changes in tool technologies and in the scale of communal activities. All of these changes are visible in the archaeological record of the Younger Dryas period in the Fertile Crescent, and all of them speak to the responsiveness of human communities to rapid environmental change. The fact that Göbekli Tepe was being built or was already in use during the Younger Dryas makes it a potential witness to some of those changes, and future research may be able to detect in the site's stratigraphy the signals of the ecological and social disruptions that the Younger Dryas caused. The discussion of the histories of gender roles and women's contribution in the communities that built Göbekli Tepe is an aspect of the site's history that archaeology cannot yet illuminate directly, because the human remains found at the site are scarce and their analysis is still in progress. Studies of gender in the archaeology of the early Neolithic of the Fertile Crescent suggest that the communities of that period had gender-based divisions of labor that were different from those that characterized later agrarian societies, with women likely playing a central role in food processing and in the transmission of the botanical knowledge needed to identify, harvest and prepare the wild plants that formed the basis of the diet. The future of research at Göbekli Tepe and related sites is extraordinarily promising. New high-resolution dating techniques will allow more precise dates to be established for the creation of individual reliefs, potentially distinguishing between different decoration episodes on the same column. Ancient DNA analysis of human remains found at the site and related settlements will allow the genetic structure of the communities that built it to be reconstructed. And systematic geophysical surveys of the area around the excavated site will gradually reveal the complete extent of the monumental complex, which according to current estimates could be several times larger than the known portion. The Göbekli Tepe we know today is only the beginning of what we will come to know. The management of the site as archaeological heritage raises challenges that go beyond simple physical conservation. Göbekli Tepe is today one of Turkey's most visited archaeological sites, attracting hundreds of thousands of tourists each year since it was declared a World Heritage Site by UNESCO in 2018. That massive influx generates the economic resources that finance excavations and conservation, but also creates pressures on the site that managers must carefully navigate. The question of what motivated the builders of Göbekli Tepe to invest such extraordinary effort in their monumental project ultimately connects to one of the deepest questions in human psychology. What makes us willing to sacrifice immediate comfort and resources for a collective goal whose benefits are diffuse, long-term, and partly symbolic? The modern equivalents of the communal effort that built Göbekli Tepe include the great public works projects, the building of cathedrals, the funding of scientific research, and the creation of public art that characterizes every human society at every level of complexity. The willingness to contribute to such projects, to bear costs now for benefits that may not be fully realized for generations, is one of the characteristics that most clearly distinguishes human societies from those of other animals. And Göbekli Tepe shows that this willingness is not a product of civilization but one of its preconditions. The construction of a protective cover over the excavated parts of the site, completed in 2017, was a controversial decision because it alters the visual appearance of the place and changes the microclimatic conditions under which the structures have existed during centuries of partial excavation. But it was necessary to protect the reliefs from the rain and sun that were degrading them at a worrying rate. The discussion about whether Göbekli Tepe was a temple, a cemetery, an astronomical observatory, a market, a place of initiation, or some combination of all those functions reflects both the limitations of our knowledge and the human tendency to want to categorize the unknown in terms of the known. The categories we use to describe places of special use, temple, market, palace, cemetery, are categories derived from our experience of historical societies, and they may not be appropriate categories for describing a place created by a society radically different from any historical society we know. There is something profoundly comforting in the story of Göbekli Tepe that is difficult to articulate but felt clearly when one stops to think about it. In a world where the pace of change seems to leave no time for anything that is not immediately useful, in which the short term dominates over the long, in which efficiency has become the supreme value, the story of people who moved 20-ton columns to the top of a hill for reasons that no cost-benefit analysis could justify is a reminder that human beings are also capable of something different. We are capable of investing effort and time in projects that have no other reward than the meaning they produce, and of sustaining that effort across generations. That capacity, which Göbekli Tepe documents with unmatched clarity, is perhaps the most hopeful thing that archaeology can tell us about our species. The great stone monuments that human beings have built throughout history, from Göbekli Tepe to the pyramids of Giza, from Stonehenge to the Moai sculptures of Easter Island, all share a characteristic that goes beyond their physical scale. They all represent an affirmation of permanence in a world that human beings know to be transitory. Building something in stone is affirming that something will continue to exist when one has disappeared, that the collective effort of a generation can leave a lasting mark on the world. That need for permanence, for leaving something that lasts longer than an individual life, is one of the most profoundly human needs that exist, and Göbekli Tepe is its first documented monumental expression. The research on Göbekli Tepe's water management extends beyond the ventilation function of the hill. Geomorphological studies show that the site was built in a position that maximized rainwater collection. That attention to water management suggests that the builders had sophisticated knowledge of local hydrology incorporated into their design decisions. A gathering place where large groups of people need water over extended periods requires careful hydrological planning, and the evidence suggests Göbekli Tepe's builders provided exactly that. The contemplation of Göbekli Tepe from the perspective of the time separating its construction from the present has the peculiar quality of making 12,000 years seem simultaneously an eternity and an instant. An eternity, because in that time dozens of civilizations have arisen and fallen, languages and religions and forms of government have changed, empires that in their moment seemed destined to last forever have appeared and disappeared. An instant, because on the geological or evolutionary timescale, 12,000 years is an almost insignificant fraction. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Modern humans have been here for at least 300,000 years. And Göbekli Tepe was built 12,000 years ago, in the last 1% of our species' history. The night sky that the builders of Göbekli Tepe saw was, in one important respect, identical to the one we can see today. The same stars, the same constellations, the same Milky Way blazing overhead on clear nights away from artificial light. But in another respect it was profoundly different. They had no competing light sources, no electric illumination to dim the sky, no air pollution to scatter the light. The sky they saw from their hilltop ritual site was the sky in its full unmediated glory, a spectacle of a kind that almost no one alive today has ever experienced. For communities that organized their ritual calendar around astronomical events, the night sky was not a backdrop but a fundamental feature of the landscape, as important and as meaningful as the hills and rivers and forests of the physical world. Understanding Göbekli Tepe requires trying to see the world as its builders saw it, including the sky that hung over their ceremonies. The conservation of the site's carved surfaces is a daily concern for the team responsible for its management. The limestone of the columns is relatively soft and susceptible to weathering, and the biological communities that colonize rock surfaces, including lichens, mosses, bacteria, and algae, produce acids and mechanical forces that gradually erode the carved details. The protective structures erected over the excavated areas help by reducing the wetting and drying cycles that accelerate weathering, but they also create a more humid microenvironment that can promote biological growth on the stone surfaces. Finding the right balance between protection from rain and sun on one hand and control of biological colonization on the other is one of the central technical challenges of managing the site, and it requires ongoing monitoring and periodic intervention by conservation specialists. The questions that Göbekli Tepe raises about the origin of civilization are also questions about the future. If complex social organization and cultural creativity do not necessarily require agriculture, writing, or cities to develop, then the possibilities of what human beings can create and maintain are broader than conventional models of progress suggest. The late Epi-Paleolithic communities found ways to organize large-scale collective cooperation without any of the institutions we associate with civilization. That achievement, which for decades seemed impossible and which is now documented in the stone of Göbekli Tepe, is an invitation to think more creatively about the forms of social organization that are possible in the future, not just those we have inherited from the past. The silence of Göbekli Tepe when the tourists have gone and the sun sets over the arid hills of southeastern Turkey is a different silence from any other place. It is the silence of 12,000 years of unanswered questions, of rituals whose meaning has been lost, of communities that existed and disappeared without leaving more trace than their stone monuments. And yet in that silence there is something that is not emptiness but fullness, the presence of everything that happened there, of all the people who gathered under that sky, of all the feasts celebrated, of all the songs sung, of all the fears faced and all the hopes placed in those stone columns. The past does not disappear. It transforms into the silence of the places that lived it. The long-distance exchange networks that connected the communities of the Fertile Crescent during the Epi-Paleolithic and early Neolithic are documented by the presence of obsidian objects at Göbekli Tepe from volcanic sources located more than 200 kilometers away. Those networks were not simply economic arrangements for the exchange of useful materials. They were also channels for the circulation of ideas, symbolic systems, artistic styles, and ritual practices. Göbekli Tepe would have been one of the main nodes of those networks, a place where communities from a wide area gathered periodically, exchanged people, objects, and information, and renewed the social bonds that made regional-scale cooperation possible. The history of the discovery and systematic study of Göbekli Tepe also illustrates how archaeological knowledge progresses in unexpected leaps rather than smoothly. The site had been visible and had been noted by researchers for decades before its true significance was recognized. That recognition required not just the right person in the right place, but also the right conceptual framework, a preparedness to see what was there rather than what was expected. Klaus Schmidt had spent years thinking about the preconditions for the Neolithic Revolution, and when he stood on that hill in 1994, he had the mental tools to recognize what he was looking at. That story is a reminder that scientific discovery is as much about asking the right questions as about finding the right answers. The role of the Neolithic Revolution in creating the conditions for all subsequent human civilization is difficult to overstate, and Göbekli Tepe's position at or near the beginning of that revolution makes it one of the most significant archaeological sites ever discovered. The chain of consequences that flows from the domestication of plants and animals in the Fertile Crescent between 12 and 8,000 years ago includes the first cities, the first writing, the first legal codes, the first organized religions, the first empires, and ultimately the entire structure of modern civilization. We are all, in a profound sense, the inheritors of what began in the hills of southeastern Turkey in the presence of those great carved stones. Göbekli Tepe teaches us also something about patience. The 12,000 years separating its construction from our present are time enough for everything to change. Languages, borders, religions, technologies, forms of government. And yet the stone pillars are still there, and the questions that motivated their builders are still ours. The search for meaning has not changed. The need for belonging has not changed. The desire to create something that lasts has not changed. In that sense, Göbekli Tepe is not a testimony of the past but a mirror of the present, a stone surface in which, if we look with sufficient attention, we can see something of what we are reflected. The fact that Göbekli Tepe was built by communities who did not yet have pottery is one of the small details that most powerfully communicates the strangeness of their world relative to ours. Pottery is so fundamental to our sense of what settled communities look like, so closely associated in the archaeological imagination with the Neolithic way of life, that its absence at Göbekli Tepe can be initially surprising. But its absence makes perfect sense. Pottery is heavy, fragile, and useful primarily for the long-term storage of agricultural surpluses. Hunter-gatherer communities that move regularly have no use for it and every reason to avoid it. The builders of Göbekli Tepe stored knowledge and social relationships, not grain. Their technology was adapted to their needs, as all technology must be, and those needs were different from ours in ways that the absence of pottery captures more vividly than any number of general statements about the Epipaleolithic way of life. The archaeological research will never be finished. Every answer opens new questions. Every discovery reveals new gaps in our knowledge. That is especially true in the case of Göbekli Tepe, where the proportion between the known and the unknown remains overwhelmingly favorable to the unknown. But that proportion is not a failure of science but a promise. The promise that the generations that come after us will continue to find things that will surprise, that will contradict the certainties of the present, and that will once again expand the horizons of what human beings believe to be possible. Göbekli Tepe has been waiting 12,000 years to be understood. It can wait a little longer. The work of scientific outreach about Göbekli Tepe has had consequences that go beyond the simple popularization of archaeological knowledge. By presenting to a wide audience the evidence that human beings were capable of sophisticated social and cultural organization much earlier than was believed, the archaeologists who work at the site have contributed to changing the popular perception of prehistory in ways that have broader philosophical and ethical implications. If the hunter-gatherers of the Epipaleolithic were capable of creating monuments like Göbekli Tepe, then the narrative of linear progress from primitive barbarism to advanced civilization is unsustainable, and with it falls also the implicit justification that narrative has historically provided for the treatment of non-Western or non-industrialized cultures as inferior or less developed. And you, tonight, can let that thought accompany you as sleep arrives. The stone pillars of a hill in Turkey are older than any civilization we have known. They have seen the sun rise and set more than 4 million times since they were carved. They have survived invasions and empires, climate changes and earthquakes, oblivion and rediscovery. And they are still there, waiting to be understood. That patience of the stone, that durability of meaning in the face of the passing of time, is perhaps the best answer that archaeology can give to the fears that wake us in the night and that sleep, mercifully, silences again. Tonight, while sleep approaches, Think of the builders of Göbekli Tepe, not as abstract figures from a remote and incomprehensible past, but as people who had the same fears, the same affections, the same need for meaning that you have. People who looked at the same starry sky that you can look at from your window, who wondered about the origin of things and their place in the cosmos, who found in gathering with other human beings and in the creation of sacred places a provisional answer to those questions. Their answers were different from ours, expressed in a language of stone columns and animal reliefs that we can no longer fully read. But the question was the same. And in that shared question there is a continuity that crosses 12,000 years of human history and connects us with them in a way that is deeper than any biological kinship. The philosophical implications of Göbekli Tepe extend to our understanding of what it means to be human. One of the standard definitions of humanity in popular discourse emphasizes our capacity for reason, our ability to plan for the future, our command of language, and our creation of culture. Göbekli Tepe demonstrates that all of those capacities were already fully operational 12,000 years ago, in communities that lived without agriculture, writing, metal tools, or any of the other markers that are sometimes used to define civilization. The site forces us to ask what we actually mean when we say that ancient people were primitive or that civilization began at some particular moment in history. The answer, it turns out, is mostly that we were wrong about what civilization is and what it requires. Göbekli Tepe is not the beginning of civilization in the conventional sense. It is the proof that civilization, in the sense of complex symbolic culture and coordinated collective action, predates the conditions we had assumed were necessary for it. The legacy of Göbekli Tepe in popular culture and contemporary imagination is already considerable, despite the fact that the site was only made known to the general public in the 1990s. It has appeared in documentaries, novels, video games, and countless popular articles. It has inspired speculative theories about lost civilizations and forgotten ancestral knowledge that the responsible archaeologists find generally exaggerated or outright incorrect, but which reveal something important about the human need to find in the remote past answers to questions about origin and meaning that the present cannot satisfy. Göbekli Tepe has touched something deep in the contemporary collective imagination, and that resonance, even when it expresses itself in ways archaeologists find frustrating, is itself an interesting fact about our relationship with the deep past of our species. The builders of Göbekli Tepe also left us a lesson about the relationship between constraint and creativity. They were operating under severe constraints, limited tools, limited materials, limited time, and the pressing need to create a functional gathering place that would serve their community's ritual needs. Those constraints did not prevent creative engineering solutions, but in many ways drove them. The ventilation of their outdoor ritual space, the structural stability of their stone enclosures, the distribution of water for thousands of gathered participants. All of these were solutions to specific problems generated by the constraints of monumental construction without metal tools or wheeled transport. That creativity under constraint, which Göbekli Tepe documents in stone, is as much a part of the human inheritance as the monuments themselves. The cities that existed before history began are still there, buried under the hills of southeastern Turkey, waiting to be understood. The question is not whether they will give up more of their secrets, but only how long it will take and what tools the archaeologists who receive those secrets will bring to bear on them. The Göbekli Tepe of the next generation of researchers will be a richer and stranger place than the one we know today, just as the Göbekli Tepe we know today is richer and stranger than the one that Klaus Schmidt first glimpsed in 1994. That is how science works, not by arriving at final answers, but by deepening the questions that make the world more interesting and more human. Let that thought accompany you into sleep tonight. The stone pillars are there in the dark, patient and enduring. The questions they embody have waited 12,000 years for us to ask them properly. Our concerns can wait until morning. The sediment cores drilled from lake beds and wetlands across the Fertile Crescent have provided an independent record of the environmental changes that accompanied the rise and development of Göbekli Tepe. Those cores, which preserve pollen, phytoliths, charcoal, and other biological and chemical proxies, allow paleoclimatologists to reconstruct temperature, precipitation, vegetation cover, and fire frequency across the region with decade-scale resolution going back more than 20,000 years. Reading those environmental records alongside the archaeological record of human activity at Göbekli Tepe and related sites produces a detailed picture of how human communities and their environments co-evolved during the crucial transition from the late Pleistocene to the early Holocene. That co-evolutionary perspective, which integrates human agency with environmental constraint and opportunity, is increasingly central to the way archaeologists understand the Neolithic transition. The long-term legacy of Göbekli Tepe in the development of religious and symbolic traditions across the ancient Near East is a question that scholars approach with a mixture of fascination and caution. The 12,000 years separating Göbekli Tepe from the first historical religious texts is an enormous gulf across which it is genuinely difficult to trace the transmission of specific ideas or practices. And yet some researchers point to certain motifs in the later religious imagery of Mesopotamia and Egypt that bear resemblance to elements of Göbekli Tepe's iconography, suggesting that long chains of cultural transmission, mediated through the many intermediate sites and traditions of the Neolithic and Chalcolithic, may have carried some of the symbolic vocabulary of the Epi-Paleolithic world into the historical era. Those connections, if they can be firmly established, would make Göbekli Tepe not just the oldest monumental site we know, but also a genuine ancestor of the religious traditions that have shaped civilization ever since. The experience of reading about Göbekli Tepe and then actually standing at the site, surrounded by those enormous carved pillars in the dry Anatolian air, is described by most visitors as a moment of genuine cognitive reorientation. The abstract knowledge that the site is 12,000 years old and was built without agriculture or metal tools exists in a different register from the bodily knowledge of standing in its presence, looking up at carvings that were made by human hands under a sky that has been shining the same way for all of recorded human history and long before. That bodily knowledge, the physical reality of the site's scale and its age and its care, cannot be fully communicated by any description or photograph or documentary. It requires presence. And that presence, which hundreds of thousands of visitors now experience each year, is one of the most powerful and most important experiences that the ancient world still has to offer the living. The study of Göbekli Tepe has also renewed interest in a broader class of sites that archaeologists call aggregation sites, places where mobile communities gathered periodically for social, ritual, and economic purposes before settling permanently. Those aggregation sites, which have been documented on every inhabited continent in the ethnographic and archaeological records of hunter-gatherer societies, represent a form of social institution that is intermediate between the complete mobility of nomadic bands and the permanent settlement of agricultural villages. Understanding Göbekli Tepe as an aggregation site rather than a permanent settlement helps explain many of its distinctive features: the lack of domestic refuse, the emphasis on ritual over utilitarian architecture, the evidence of short-term intensive use rather than continuous habitation, and the wide geographic catchment of visitors. It also connects Göbekli Tepe to a global pattern of human social organization that predates the Neolithic and that may have been one of the preconditions for the Neolithic transition in many parts of the world. The extraordinary longevity of Göbekli Tepe as an active site, spanning approximately 2,000 years of use, means that the communities that maintained it through that entire period must have possessed a form of institutional continuity that could survive the deaths of individual leaders, the failures of individual seasons, and the inevitable disagreements and conflicts that arise in any human community over such a long period. That institutional continuity, whatever its specific mechanisms, is itself a remarkable achievement that deserves more attention than it usually receives in discussions of the site. Most human institutions are much shorter-lived than Göbekli Tepe's 2,000 years of active use. The Göbekli Tepe tradition outlasted the Roman Empire, would outlast most modern nation-states, and comes close to matching the entire span of recorded history. Understanding how it sustained itself for that long would tell us something important about the conditions under which human cooperative institutions can achieve genuine durability. The stone itself that composes the pillars of Göbekli Tepe has a story to tell about the geological history of the region that contains it. The limestone from which the columns were carved was deposited in a shallow sea that covered the region during the Cretaceous period, between approximately 165 million and 66 million years ago. The fossils of the marine organisms that built that limestone, tiny shells and skeletal fragments of organisms that lived in that ancient sea, are preserved in the rock of the pillars themselves, invisible to the naked eye but detectable under magnification. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were working with rock that had itself been built by life, over timescales that would have been incomprehensible to them as they were incomprehensible to everyone until the development of modern geology. And in carving that rock into images of the animals they knew, they were, in a sense, adding the most recent chapter to a story of life inscribed in stone that had been accumulating for millions of years. The discoveries at Göbekli Tepe have also had a significant impact on how archaeologists interpret other sites from the same period that had previously been understood in more limited terms. Sites that had been classified as simple campsites or temporary hunting stations are now being reconsidered in light of the possibility that they may have been nodes in the same network of periodic gathering and ritual activity that Göbekli Tepe made visible. That process of reinterpretation, which is still in its early stages, may significantly expand the known distribution of complex ritual behavior in the late Epipaleolithic of the Near East and potentially of other regions where similar social dynamics may have played out. The relationship between human beings and the animals depicted in Göbekli Tepe's reliefs was not simply one of predator and prey. For hunter-gatherer communities, wild animals are participants in a world of meaningful relationships, beings with their own powers and their own places in the cosmos, whose behavior is studied, anticipated and engaged with through ritual as much as through practical hunting skill. The animals on the pillars of Göbekli Tepe, the vultures and the foxes and the snakes and the cranes, were not just food sources or dangerous creatures to be feared. They were presences in a world alive with significance. Powerful beings whose representation in the sacred space of the enclosures carried meanings that we can only partially reconstruct from the fragments of analogous belief systems documented in later cultures. The silence that falls over the Göbekli Tepe site in the hours before dawn, when the tourists have gone and the archaeological team has retired for the night, is a silence of extraordinary depth. The stars that appear over the dark Anatolian hills are the same stars that the builders saw, arranged in the same patterns, moving in the same rhythms. The wind that stirs the dry grasses on the hillsides has been moving across this landscape for millions of years. And the stone pillars stand in their circles, patient and enduring, having outlasted every civilization that has risen and fallen in their vicinity. In that silence, the 12,000 years between their creation and our present collapses into something almost manageable. A very long time, yes, but one in which human beings were always human, always making meaning, always looking up at the same sky and asking the same questions that we ask tonight. The cities that existed before history began have something to teach us that the cities that came after cannot quite replicate: the lesson of possibility. They demonstrate that human beings were capable of extraordinary things before they had any of the tools that we have conventionally assumed were necessary for those extraordinary things. They demonstrate that the need for meaning, for community, for beauty and for sacred space is not a product of civilization but one of its engines, a force that was driving human creativity and social organization long before the first field was plowed or the first word was written. That lesson of possibility is one that every generation needs to learn freshly, because every generation tends to assume that what is true of its own moment has always been true, that the way things are is the way they have always been and therefore must be. Göbekli Tepe is a corrective to that assumption, a 12,000-year-old reminder that human beings are far stranger, far more creative, and far more capable than any settled moment of civilization tends to suggest. There is one more thing that Göbekli Tepe teaches us, perhaps the most important of all. It teaches us that the story of humanity did not begin with the written record. It did not begin with the first city or the first field. It began in the deep past, with communities whose names we do not know and whose languages we cannot speak, who looked at the world around them and decided that it was not enough simply to survive in it. They needed to make it meaningful. They needed to gather with others under the open sky, to carve the animals they loved and feared into permanent stone, to create spaces that were set apart from the ordinary world and consecrated to something larger than any individual life. That need, which drove them to move 20-ton columns up a hill with nothing but ropes and human muscle, is the same need that drives every act of art and every act of faith and every act of collective creation in our own time. We are their descendants. We carry their impulse. And tonight, as sleep approaches, we can rest in the knowledge that what is most essentially human in us has been there since long before history began to record it. The cities that existed before history are there still, patient in the ground, waiting for the next generation of archaeologists with their better tools and their sharper questions. And we are here, their latest inheritors, carrying in our genes and our imaginations the legacy of 12,000 years of human creativity. The excavations will continue. The discoveries will accumulate. The picture of who we were at the dawn of our civilizational journey will become clearer and richer and more surprising with every season of fieldwork. And through all of that accumulation of knowledge, the fundamental fact that Göbekli Tepe established will remain unchanged. Human beings were capable of extraordinary things long before history gave us credit for them. Rest now, with that knowledge as your companion. The questions that Göbekli Tepe embodies have waited millennia for answers. They can wait one more night, while you sleep. Göbekli Tepe also invites reflection on what we value in our own civilization and why. We tend to measure the achievements of past societies by the standards of our own, by the scale of their cities, the sophistication of their technology, the complexity of their political systems. By those measures, the communities that built Göbekli Tepe score poorly. No cities, primitive technology, no state. But by the measures that they themselves might have used, the richness of their ritual life, the strength of their social bonds, the depth of their engagement with the natural world and the cosmos, the quality of the meaning they were able to create and share, they may have surpassed many of the societies that came after them. That inversion of our usual evaluative framework is one of the most intellectually productive gifts that Göbekli Tepe offers to the modern world. The warmth of the limestone in the afternoon sun at Göbekli Tepe, heated by the same solar energy that warmed the builders who placed it there, is a small but real connection across 12,000 years. Stone stores heat slowly and releases it slowly, and on a warm afternoon the surface of the ancient columns feels almost alive to the touch, radiating a gentle warmth that has been absorbed and re-radiated daily for longer than any living thing on Earth can remember. That warmth is a physical continuity that no photograph or description can convey, a thread of sensation connecting the present moment to the deep past of our species. The builders of Göbekli Tepe stood in the warmth of these same stones. They put their hands on this same rock. They felt this same sun. In that small physical fact, the 12,000 years between us dissolve into something that feels almost like recognition. The sites that existed before history began are not relics of a dead past. They are living arguments about what human beings are and what we are capable of. Every time a new excavation at Göbekli Tepe or at one of its sister sites reveals another carved surface, another structural element, another fragment of the material world of the first monument builders, that argument gets stronger and more detailed. We are not the descendants of barbarians who stumbled toward civilization by accident. We are the heirs of people who looked at the world with intelligence and imagination and responded with creation. That inheritance is worth honoring, tonight and every night. If this journey kept you company tonight, subscribe to the channel. There are many more worlds waiting to be explored in the dark.